She didn't ask for directions. She didn't explain herself. She simply walked into the hardware store in the middle of a northern Alberta ice storm, set a handwritten list on the counter, and waited. Declan Voss had turned away 4 women in 3 years, not unkindly, not with drama. He just didn't show up to the second date, didn't return the phone calls, didn't meet anyone's eyes long enough for it to become something that required explaining. The men at the mill called him steady. The women in town called him closed. Both were right. He was 39 years old, owned 1,200 acres of boreal forest, and a sawmill that had been in his family since 1961. And he ate supper alone every night in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and nothing else. The woman at his counter had dark hair plastered flat from the sleet, a canvas work jacket 2 sizes too large, and the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with being quiet. She looked at him the way people look at hardware stores, like she needed something specific and wasn't going to leave without it. He looked at the list: 12-gauge staples, half-inch screws, wire fencing clip, 2 hinges. Fence repair, he suffered. She said yes. He said, "You've got a property out here?" She said, "My aunt did, now I do." He pulled the items without saying anything else, set them on the counter, named the price. She paid in exact change, which people never did. She picked up the bag and walked back out into the sleet without asking for a bag for the bag, or saying anything about the weather, or mentioning that she'd driven 4 hours on an ice road from Edmonton to get here. His assistant, a 64-year-old man named Gord who had worked for the Voss family for 22 years and had never once kept an observation to himself, watched her go. "That's the Fenwick place," Gord said. "Old Ruth's niece, been empty 4 years," Declan said. "I know whose place it is." Gord said, "She's got a lot of work ahead of her." Declan said, "That's not our problem." Gord nodded in the particular way he had, that meant he was agreeing with his mouth and doing the opposite with his brain. He picked up his cough cup and said nothing else. But he wrote the date down on the margin of the inventory sheet when Declan went into the back. He did that sometimes with things that felt like they mattered. He wasn't sure why this one did. He just knew it did. Her name was Lena Fenwick. She was 31 years old and she had come to Dunmore, Alberta, with a used pickup truck, $11,000, a chainsaw she didn't fully know how to use, and the deed to 46 acres of boreal land with a house on it that had been empty since her Aunt Ruth died, and nobody in the family wanted to deal with it. She had taken a leave from her job in Edmonton, contract editing, the kind of work that was invisible and necessary and paid exactly enough to make leaving it feel only half stupid. And she had told herself she was coming to sort out the estate. She had not told anyone that she was actually running. The thing she was running from was not dramatic. That was the part that made it hard to explain. There was no violence, no betrayal, no single moment she could point to and say, "There, that was the thing." There was just 5 years of a relationship with a man named Paul who was kind in most of the right ways and loved her in a way that required her to be smaller and calmer and more manageable than she actually was. And she had tried. She had gotten very good at the trying. She had trimmed herself down to the shape that fit neatly beside his life. And one morning in November she had woken up and looked at the ceiling and thought, "I cannot remember the last time I said what I actually thought." She had not cried. She had made coffee, and she had written down 3 things she needed to do, and she had done them. That was who she was. The house on the 46 acres needed a new front step, a repaired fence line on the east side, new weather stripping on 2 windows, and someone to come out and look at the wood stove before she tried to use it. She had the list. She had the materials. She was going to be fine. The wood stove problem sent her back to the hardware store 4 days later. Declan was behind the counter again. He looked up when she came in and looked back down at what he was doing, which was reconciling an invoice that wasn't reconciling. He finished what he was doing before he acknowledged her, which she noticed and did not find rude because she would have done the same thing. She described the wood stove. He asked 2 questions, precise ones, about the model and the draw issue. She answered them precisely. He told her it was likely the damper plate and that she could adjust it herself if she wanted to, or he could send someone out, and the someone he sent out would be Gord, who charged $60 an hour and was worth $120. She said she'd try it herself first. He said, "Fair enough," and drew a diagram on the back of a receipt. An actual diagram, small and exact with the damper plate labeled and an arrow showing which direction to turn it. She looked at it. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. "This is more than I expected." "It's a diagram," he said. She almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before she pulled it back and returned to the invoice. She left. He stared at the invoice for 40 seconds without reading it. Gord, who had been pretending to sort nails nearby, said nothing at all, which was so unlike him that Declan looked up. Gord said, "Still not our problem?" Declan said, "Go sort something useful." She came back in 2 weeks later with the diagram which she'd folded and put in her jacket pocket, and she said the damper plate had worked for 3 days, and then the problem came back, different this time, lower. She described it methodically. He listened. He asked one question. She answered it. He said that was a cracked firebox plate, and that he could not in good conscience let her deal with that one on her own, and he could come out Saturday morning if that worked for her. She said that worked. He said 7:30. She said, "I'll have coffee on." He almost said she didn't have to, and then he didn't say it, because she hadn't offered it as a social nicety. She'd said it the way someone says a thing that is simply true. He came at 7:30. The place was in better shape than he expected. The front step she'd repaired herself, not perfectly but solidly, with good fasteners and the right wood for the grade. The fence on the east side was done, all of it, staples and clips, exactly as listed on the receipt he still had somewhere. There were split logs stacked neatly under the overhang, and a pair of work gloves on the porch railing with one finger torn, and a strip of electrical tape around it, because she'd needed the gloves more than she needed to go back to town. He looked at the tape on the finger of the glove and felt something he didn't try to name. The coffee was good. She set a mug in front of him and went back to what she'd been doing at the kitchen table, which was reading a land survey map of the 46 acres with a pencil in her hand. She didn't hover. She didn't try to make conversation. She just existed in the kitchen the way someone exists in a space they've decided to take seriously. He fixed the firebox plate in 40 minutes. He told her what he'd done and why. She listened carefully. He showed her how to check it going forward. She asked one question, good one, about what to do if the same symptoms came back with a correctly seated plate. He told her. She nodded. He meant to leave. He was in his truck, and his hand was on the key, and instead of starting it, he sat there for a moment, looking at the cleared path from the house to the woodpile, which she'd done with a push shovel, and the way the birch at the corner of the property had been limbed up partway, the kind of thing you did when you were planning to be somewhere for a while. He went back to the door. She opened it before he knocked, which meant she'd heard the truck not start. He said, "I have a contact at the county land office. If you're planning to use the back 40 for anything, there are easement questions you should know about before you start." She looked at him. The look was not surprised. It was more like a person checking whether something they suspected was actually there. She said, "Come in then. I'll make more coffee." He stayed 2 hours. They talked about the land, the easements, the property history, and somewhere in the middle of it, she told him she'd been a contract editor, and he said he didn't know what that was exactly, and she explained it plainly, without performing modesty or expertise. And he said that sounded like the kind of work that made you very good at finding what was wrong, and not very well paid for it. And she said, "Yes, that's it exactly," and the quality of the silence after that was the kind that has weight. He did not ask about Paul. He did not ask about Edmonton. He did not ask why a 31-year-old woman from the city had come to 46 acres of northern boreal in November to fix a wood stove and read survey maps on a Saturday morning. She did not volunteer any of it. When he left the second time, he actually left. But Gord noticed the next Monday that the invoice that had been sitting unreconciled on the counter for 3 weeks had finally been filed. The weeks after that were cold in the particular way that the north was cold, which was not dramatic, but was absolute. Lena Fenwick worked the property the way she did most things, methodically and without announcing it. She cleared the south field of deadfall. She replaced the weather stripping she'd listed. She found a problem with the eaves on the north side of the house and dealt with it before it became a worse problem. And she taught herself to use the chainsaw properly by watching 2 videos and then practicing on a dead birch until she trusted herself. She came into the hardware store every week or so. Not always for much, sometimes for a single item. Declan noticed the pattern, but said nothing about it, and told himself it meant nothing, and was largely unsuccessful at the telling. What he noticed was this. She never bought more than she needed for the job at hand. She asked questions that showed she'd already thought about the problem before she got to the store. She listened to the answers the way people listened when they intended to actually use them. She never said anything she didn't mean. He had been around a great many people who said things they didn't mean. He had become expert at waiting for the translation. With Lena Fenwick, there was no translation required, which was so unusual it took him several weeks to stop waiting for the other layer to appear. She said what she thought. She did what she said she would. She did not perform gratitude, and she did not perform confidence. When she didn't know something, she said so. When she did know something, she said that instead. He could not explain why this was affecting him in the way it was. He was a practical man. He had built the Sawmill's supply operation from 30 clients to 240 over 15 years by being direct, reliable, and uninterested in pretense. He understood practical people. He had thought he was one. He was discovering that he had confused practical with defended, and that they were not the same thing at all. Gord noticed. Of course Gord noticed. He said on a Wednesday afternoon in February, while they were taking inventory, "You've been up to the Fenwick place 3 times now." Declan said, "There were legitimate reasons each time." Gord said, "I didn't say there weren't." Declan kept counting hinges. Gord said, "She's good people. Arlene at the post office says she helped Mrs. Dubois get her car out of the ditch last week without being asked and without making a fuss about it afterward." Declan said, "I'm glad to hear it." Gord said, "That's all you've got?" Declan said, Gord. Gord said, "Yes, sir," and went back to counting hinges with the expression of a man who was finished talking and had said everything he intended to say. The 4th time Declan went to the Fenwick property, it was because of an ice storm that took out a section of the power line on the rural grid, and he was running the check on properties that had been flagged as non-priority, and hers was one of them, and he was in the area anyway. That was the reason. He had 4 reasons lined up in his head, and all of them were accurate, and none of them were the actual reason. She had the generator running. She had figured out the transfer switch herself. She was making soup. He stood in the doorway and looked at a woman who had in 3 months taken a neglected property in the northern boreal and turned it into something that worked, and who was now standing at her stove making soup during a power outage with the particular quality of calm that belonged to people who had stopped needing the world to cooperate before they could function. She looked at him over her shoulder. She said, "Power's out." He said, "I know. I'm doing the grid check." She said, "Sit down. Soup's almost ready." He sat down. She put a bowl in front of him, venison and barley, something she'd made from scratch, and it was the best thing he'd eaten in a period of time he couldn't calculate exactly, but knew was too long, he said. "This is very good," she said. "Ruth's recipe. She left me a box of them. It took me a while to find the box." He said, "How long have you been cooking this way?" She said, "I haven't been. I learned it here. I didn't cook much in Edmonton." He said, "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. A real pause, not a social one. The kind where a person is deciding whether the honest answer is appropriate, and not whether to give a polished answer instead. "Paul didn't like mess in the kitchen," she said. "He said it very reasonably. And I cooked the way I did everything for a while, which was to make myself smaller than the problem." Declan turned his spoon in the bowl. He said, "Past tense." She said, "Very past tense." He said, "When did you figure it out?" She said, "November. I woke up on a Tuesday and I realized I hadn't said what I actually thought in so long I wasn't sure I knew what I actually thought anymore." She paused. "That's the kind of thing that sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, but it happened very quietly. Nobody knew, not even Paul." Declan was quiet. The generator hummed. Outside, the ice was doing what ice did. He said, "What did you do?" She said, "I made a list. I've always made lists. I put 3 things on it. And I did the 3 things. And by the end of the week, I'd given my notice at the apartment and called the land registry office about the Fenwick property and booked a truck." He said, "Did anyone try to talk you out of it?" She said, "Paul did. Very reasonably. He had a lot of reasonable arguments, and every one of them was true. And none of them were the point." Declan said, "What was the point?" She looked at him directly. The kind of direct that did not flinch and did not ask anything back. She said, "The point was that I needed to be somewhere I was allowed to take up space." "The kitchen was very quiet," he said. "And here?" She looked around at the kitchen. Ruth had left her, the survey map still on the table, the recipe box on the counter, the snow pressing against the window with the new weather stripping. "Here," she said, "is where I take up as much space as I want." He went home that night and lay awake looking at the ceiling of the house his grandfather had built in 1958. He was not a man who lay awake. He was a man who worked until he was tired enough to sleep and slept without complications. He lay awake for 2 hours. He thought about Sarah, which he rarely let himself do. Sarah had been his wife for 4 years, and then she had gotten sick, and then she had died, and the dying had been very slow and very hard, and when it was over, he had gone back to the sawmill and the 1,200 acres and the house his grandfather built, and he had worked and worked and worked until working was the whole of what he was. He told himself afterward that he had grieved properly. He told himself he had made peace with it. He was 41 years old, and he had made peace with most things about his life. What he had not told himself, because he was very good at the specific discipline of not telling himself things he didn't want to examine, was that he had not let anyone close in 7 years, not because he was still grieving, but because he was afraid. Not of loss, specifically. Of the particular vulnerability of being known, of letting someone matter enough to see him. Sarah had seen him. He had let her, and she had died. And the letting in had cost more than anything he'd thought he could pay. He turned this over in the dark of the room. He thought about a woman in a kitchen, making soup from her dead aunt's recipe box, saying, "I needed somewhere I was allowed to take up space," with the particular steadiness of someone who had learned to tell the truth about things even when the truth was uncomfortable, even when nobody had asked. He thought that it had been a very long time since someone had spoken to him that way. He turned over. He made himself go to sleep. He did not quite manage it. The thing that changed between them arrived in the way things did when neither person had planned it, which was the only way things like that ever really arrived. It was March. The snow was beginning to take on the quality of something that knew it was temporary. Lena had found a problem with the roof framing on the east side of the house. She'd gotten up there herself with a ladder and a flashlight and diagnosed it, which was not what most people would have done, and she'd come to the hardware store with a photograph on her phone and a specific question about sistering joists. Declan looked at the photograph. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 with the kind of precision that came from having looked at something carefully and thought about it before speaking. He said, "I can come out Saturday." She said, "I can do it myself if you walk me through it." He looked at her. She met his eyes. This happened sometimes now, the looking, and neither of them acknowledged it or moved away from it. It just happened, and then they kept talking. He said, "You could." But sistering in that kind of spacing, with that load on the east face, it goes faster with 2 people and safer. She said, "All right, Saturday." They worked for 6 hours. She was not a woman who asked unnecessary questions or got in the way or second-guessed the process. She handed tools before he asked for them. She anticipated what the next step required. She did her half of the work, without being told how, and learned what she didn't know without fuss. At one point, 3 hours in, Declan was on his back under the framing, and he needed her to hold a joist in place while he fought the thrustner, and her hands were steady for 4 minutes straight, without shaking or shifting, just held, because he'd asked her to hold, and she held. He came out from under the framing, and she handed him a water bottle without saying anything. He drank half of it and said, "You're better at this than most of my crew." She said, "I'm a fast learner when the thing matters." He said, "Does this matter?" She looked at the repaired framing. She said, "Yes, it does. This is mine." Something moved in him that he had not budgeted for. He said nothing. He put the water bottle down, and they kept working. By late afternoon, they were sitting on the porch with the last of the coffee, and the light was going long and gold, the way it went in March in Alberta when it finally started to mean something, and neither of them was talking. The silence was the comfortable kind. The kind that happened between people who didn't need to fill the space between them. He said, "Sarah would have liked this property." He had not planned to say that. He heard it come out and could not immediately account for it. She looked at him. She did not ask who Sarah was. She knew. Small towns meant she knew. She said, "I'm sorry. When did she die?" He said, 7 years ago, February. She said, "That's a long time to eat supper alone." He looked at her. The sentence had no decoration on it. It was just what it was, plain and accurate, and somehow the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 7 years. He said, "Yes, it is." She said, "What was she like?" He thought about it. He didn't often let himself think about it. He said, "Practical. Very funny when she wanted to be." She would have gotten up on that roof herself too. She would have taken the photograph first, though. Lena said, "See, I forgot the photograph the first time. I had to go back up." He almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, but she caught it, and something crossed her face that was quiet and pleased and gone before it settled. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She's yes. He said, "When you figured it out. In November. Was there a part of you that was afraid it was too late to start over?" She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She did that when she was thinking he'd noticed. A small rotation, once, twice. She said every single day. She paused, but I decided that afraid was just information. It wasn't instructions. He sat with that. He said, "That's a good distinction," she said. "I've had time to work it out." The light went down. The birches at the edge of the property caught the last of it. He said, "I should get back." She said, "I know." He stood up. She stood up. They were standing on her porch with the empty coffee cups, and the repaired house behind them, and the March dark coming in, and neither of them moved for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. He said, "Thank you for the coffee." She said, "Thank you for the roof." He said, "I'll let you know if the crew needs anything from the supply list." She said, "I'll be here." He drove home. He did not turn the radio on. He drove the 20 minutes back to the house his grandfather had built, and he sat in the driveway for a bit, and looked at the lit windows, and thought about walking in, and supper alone, and the ceiling he'd been looking at for 7 years. He thought about afraid as just information, not instructions. He went inside. He did not immediately start supper. He stood at the kitchen window for a while instead, which was something he'd stopped doing years ago, and then he started supper. Gord said, "On the following Monday, you stayed late at the Fenwick place Saturday." Declan said, "We were working." Gord said, "I heard you fix the east framing." Declan said, "Who told you that?" Gord said, "Arlene at the post office. Mrs. Dubois saw the truck." Declan said, "This town." Gord said, "This town is exactly the same as it's always been. You just used to not care what it noticed." He paused, the careful kind. What changed? Declan did not answer that. He went into the back to check the lumber inventory. Gord let him go, but he wrote the date down on the margin of a fresh invoice page and underlined it once, which was different from before when he'd just written it. What nobody talked about directly, but everyone in Dunmore eventually noticed, was that Declan Voss had started arriving at things on time again. He'd been 10 minutes late to everything for 7 years, not out of disorganization, but out of the particular inertia of a man who had stopped finding reasons to be anywhere promptly. The mill meetings, the county water board, the spring equipment check, always 10 minutes late. Always. In March he was on time. In April he was early. People didn't comment because commenting would have required explaining why they'd noticed, and explaining why they'd noticed would have required admitting they'd been watching. Gord noticed. He wrote it in the margin of nothing in particular. Just, on time again. Then he thought about it and added, figures. The thing that nearly ended it arrived on a Tuesday in April, the way bad things arrived in small towns, which was sideways and without introduction. A man named Paul Greer came into the hardware store. Declan knew who he was. Not because he'd been told, but because Paul Greer was the kind of man who introduced himself in a way that assumed you'd want to know, and because he had a rental car and clean boots, which meant Edmonton, and because he said he was looking for the Fenwick property, and could anyone tell him if Lena Fenwick was still out there? Declan told him where the Fenwick property was, because it was not his information to withhold. He gave the directions the same way he gave directions to anyone. He watched the rental car pull out of the lot, and he stood at the window of his own store for a moment. Gord said nothing, which was the loudest thing Gord had ever done. Declan said, "Go reconcile something." Gord went. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself that a woman who had come to 46 acres alone, and fixed a wood stove and a roof and a fence line, and learned to use a chainsaw did not need anyone to intercede on her behalf, or to worry on her behalf, and that it was not his place, and that the very fact he was standing at the window of his own store, instead of working, was a kind of evidence about something he had not finished thinking through. He went back to work. She came in the next morning. She set a bag on the counter. Inside was a thermos of coffee and a piece of paper, and she pushed the thermos toward him and unfolded the paper and set it flat. It was a site plan for the south field, hand-drawn, detailed, with measurements and a notation about drainage. She'd been planning something with the field, something she hadn't told him about yet. He looked at the plan. He looked at her. He said, "When did you do this?" She said, "Last night. I needed something to work on." He said, "He came to the property?" She said yes. She said it flatly, without drama, the way she said anything that was just a fact. He said, "Are you all right?" She said yes. She paused. He was very reasonable about it. Declan looked at the site plan. She said he had 4 arguments. Very calm, very organized. He wasn't wrong about any of them. He said I was making a rash decision, that I'd spent 3 months in a difficult property in bad weather, and that wasn't a real test of anything, that I wasn't thinking clearly about what I'd walked away from. She stopped. Every argument was technically accurate, Declan said. "But," she said, "but I stood on my own porch and listened to him and looked at my fence line and my stacked wood and the east wall I'd repaired myself, and I thought, I am not going back to being a person who disappears into someone else's life." And I said that to him. And he said I was being unfair, and I said, "I know it feels that way," and he left. The store was quiet, March wind off the boreal rattling the awning. He said, "You drew the site plan after." She said I needed to make something. He said, "What are you putting in the south field?" She said, "I'm not sure yet. Trees, maybe. Something that will be there for a while." He looked at her across the counter of his grandfather's hardware store and thought about a woman who responded to difficulty by drawing plans, by planting things, by building what she intended to be there in 20 years. He said, "I could help with the drainage assessment, if you want." She said, "Yes, I want," said, "Saturday." She said, "I'll have coffee on." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know." They looked at each other for a moment, the same moment that had been getting longer each time it happened. He said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. She was very good at waiting. He said, "I'm not easy to be around long term. I go quiet when things get hard. I'm better at showing up in a practical capacity than at saying what I mean. I keep people at a distance without meaning to, and I don't always know I'm doing it until afterward." She said, "I know." He said, "You know?" She said, "Gord told me." He stared at her. She said, "He brought a thermos of coffee out to the property one afternoon in February and told me you were the best man he'd ever worked for, and also that you'd been eating supper alone for 7 years, and that the last woman who'd tried to get close had given up because you'd had 3 dinners with her and then just stopped calling and never said why." He closed his eyes briefly. She said, "I found it useful information." He said, "Gord." She said, "He loves you. People who love you tell the truth about you." He said, "That is not what I was going to say." She said, "What were you going to say?" He looked at her across the counter with the site plan between them and the thermos of coffee she'd brought for him, and thought about 7 years of 10 minutes late and eating alone and going quiet when things got hard, and about a woman who drew plans after hard days, who held joists steady without being asked twice, who said afraid is just information, who had made herself smaller for 5 years inside someone else's reasonable life and had then stopped. He said, "I'm going to try, that's what I was going to say." "I don't have a cleaner version of it than that," she said. "Trying is enough. It's more than enough. It's everything, actually." She pushed the thermos toward him. She said, "Open it. The coffee's getting cold while you're being sincere." He laughed. It came out all the way, which hadn't happened in a time he couldn't calculate but knew was too long. She watched it happen with the quiet expression of someone who had suspected something and was glad to be right. The drainage assessment happened on Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and somewhere in the 3rd week of May, on an evening when they'd been walking the Southfield property line, and she had been making notes, and he had been answering questions about soil drainage with the particular pleasure of someone who knew something useful. She looked up from her notebook at the light coming through the birch at the edge of the field, and she said, "I think I'm going to stay." He said, "I was hoping you'd say that." She looked at him sidelong. "That's the most direct you've been in 6 weeks." He said, "I'm working on it." She said, "I know you are." She closed her notebook. She said, "For the record, I'm not here because I needed to be saved or because I needed a project. I'm here because when I stood at that gate in November, I could feel that this was mine. The land is mine. This life is mine." She paused. "You are not a project," he said. "What am I then?" She looked at him for a moment with the kind of directness that she'd had since the first day at the counter, the kind that didn't flinch and didn't ask for anything in return. She said, "You're who I want beside me, while I figure out what to plant in the south field." He said, "That's a generous thing to say to someone who eats supper alone." She said, past tense. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "I drew the plans. I'm always sure when I've drawn the plans." He put his hand out, and she looked at it for a second, and then she took it, and they stood at the edge of the south field in the May light, with the birch moving in the wind and the boreal stretching north, as far as either of them could see. And it was not dramatic, and it was not a speech, and it was the most honest thing that had happened to either of them in years. They planted trees in the south field that June. Spruce, mostly, because spruce lasted. Because she had said something that will be there for a while, and she had meant it, and they both knew she hadn't only been talking about the field. Gord came out to help for a Saturday. Ostensibly because Declan had asked for an extra set of hands, and not for any other reason, and he worked hard all morning and said very little and ate 3 sandwiches at lunch, and on the way home he told his wife Arlene that Declan had laughed twice before noon and that the Fenwick woman had corrected him about the spacing on the spruce, and he'd listened, actually listened, and changed the spacing. Arlene said, "Well, it's about time." Gord said, "It is." He looked out the window at the boreal going past. He said, "You know what she told me once? She said she came here to take up space." Arlene said, "And?" He said, "She is. And he's letting her. He's letting the whole house be a different shape." Arlene said, "That's the hardest thing for a man like that." Gord said, "I know it is. That's what makes it mean something." By the time the spruce were 2 feet tall, the house on the 46 acres was different. Not in the structural way, though the roof held, and the stove drew clean, and the front step didn't shift anymore. Different in the way that houses were different when someone had decided they were worth the work. There were recipe cards on the counter from Ruth's box, and muddy boots by the door in pairs, and a site plan taped to the inside of the kitchen cupboard, with notes added over months in 2 different hands. Declan didn't eat supper alone anymore. That was the plainest fact. It was also the least of what had changed, though it was the one Gord noted in the margin of a supply inventory in September, with 3 underlines and the word "finally," which was not a business notation, but which he left there anyway, because some things needed to be written somewhere. What had changed was harder to put words to, but simpler to see if you knew where to look. He showed up on time. He called his brother in BC more than twice a year. He said what he meant more often than he didn't, even when it was uncomfortable, and when he didn't say it he came back to it the next day and said it then. And she. Lena Fenwick of the survey maps and the recipe box and the careful plans. She stopped waiting for the moment when she would become too much for the space she was in. She planted a garden on the south side of the house in the spring. Herbs and perennials and 1 apple tree that would take 5 years to bear anything but which she planted anyway because she was going to be there in 5 years, and she knew it. She knew it the way she knew the property lines, the way she knew which joists needed sistering, and which soil held water, and which direction the light came from in the morning, which was the best light, which was the one she'd chosen this room for, this kitchen, this piece of land, this life. She had drawn the plans. She was always sure when she'd drawn the plans.